Today on Know the Truth from Philip DeCourcy.
You and I need to apply the right medicine to the right patient. And Paul says, hey, you be careful how you treat people. There are some people you got to pin them to the wall a little bit. The unruly definitely need to be faced. Admonish them. But the faint-hearted, comfort them. The weak, encourage them.
With Thanksgiving coming up, many of us are planning gatherings with our extended family. And while these occasions are usually joyful, they sometimes come with some conflict, don't they? I'm sure we've all experienced an awkward family dinner or two. Well, Philip DeCourcy explains that just like our biological families, the family of God is not immune to issues. So how do we face these problems when they appear? Returning to God's Word for direction as always, Philip titled this message, Life Together.
It's been famously stated and said that the church is not unlike Noah's Ark. It's not unlike Noah's Ark in this respect, that if it wasn't for the storm outside, we couldn't stick the stench inside. Now, I know that's a little bit of an overstatement, but it points to a rather raw reality, that there are times when the church is not always what it could be. The church is not always what it should be. It's not very different from the world. And that's not what should be happening. Throughout its history, from its very inception, the church has been torn asunder by division and strife, infected by false teaching and teachers, scandalized by corrupt leadership, weakened by sinning saints, and at times has failed miserably to love its enemies and to take care of its own. The church has had its fair share of figureheads and deadheads and sore heads and hot heads, all under the one head, Jesus Christ. We haven't lived up to all that we should be. The church has had its problems. In fact, let's be honest, the church sometimes is the problem. And if you don't believe me, just take another look at the letters of the New Testament. How many times does one of the apostles, James or Peter or Paul, address a problem in a church? In fact, more than often, they're troubleshooting in their letters and in their epistles. They're dealing with pride and upmanship in the church at Corinth. There's a personality syndrome going on there. There's hero worship going on there that belittles Jesus Christ and produces strife and envy among the saints. Go to Philippi and you'll find two women locking horns. Listen to their letter to the Galatians and you'll find heresy infecting that body. The New Testament writers recognize the fact that at times the church is more of a stumbling block than it is a stepping stone to Jesus Christ. Because of the church's bad behavior, it is often the reason people don't become a Christian. Instead of being the reason for people coming to faith, we become the excuse for their indifference and rejection of Christ. Gandhi said that he had no problem with Christ. It was Christians that put him off. And so the apostles address problems among people and problem people throughout their letters. In fact, it's one of their growth strategies to address those issues. If the church is ever to be attractive to the world, the church needs to fix itself. And you'll find throughout the New Testament the apostles trying to fix the saints so that they might become more attractive to the world. And that is the background I want to paint in as we come to the foreground of 1 Thessalonians chapter 5 and verses 14 through 15, because here we find an apostle, the Apostle Paul. Here we find a church, the church at Thessalonica. And here the apostle writes a letter to that church in that city addressing problems among the people and problem people. And he calls them to a greater experience of life together. He challenges them to address this issue of life together so that the church's growth isn't retarded, its witness to the world isn't spoilt, and a good thing that's going on there doesn't get ruined. He wants them to become a more loving, forgiving, kind, encouraging, pure, and patient group of Christians, so that Christians might be blessed and the church might be a magnet to the surrounding community. And so he calls them here. Warn those who are unruly. Comfort the faint-hearted. Uphold the weak. Be patient with all. See that no one renders evil for evil, but always pursue what is good, both for yourselves and for all. We need to make an effort to love each other. We need to make a constant effort to maintain the unity of the Spirit and the bond of peace. Ephesians 4, verses 1 through 3. And that's not an easy thing to do this side of heaven, because we're imperfect, we're impertinent. We're not all that we should be, and we're not all that we could be to one another. The good news is, those of us that have put our faith in Jesus Christ, we're all going to heaven. The bad news is, we're all going together. And we got to work at this thing called life together then, huh? Because we're stuck with each other for a very long time. And so we've got to sort out the problems among us and the problem people among us, so that we can be a better representation of Jesus Christ. I remember in my early Christian life struggling a little with the divisions and the cattiness among Christians. And talking to my mother about it one day in the kitchen, where she often was, in our little home in Belfast, she said, "Philip, I was taught a poem many, many years ago, and maybe it'll help you. To dwell above with saints we love, that will be glory. To dwell below with saints we know, that's a different story." It is a different story. We'll have to wait to get to heaven before we stop bugging each other and stepping on each other's toes and misreading and misrepresenting one another. I think it was Swindoll who said that Christians are like porcupines in the winter. We need each other, and the closer we get to each other, we needle each other. It's a great little statement. We need each other, but we needle each other. So let's come to this passage as Paul addresses problems among people and problem people. It's very real. It's very raw. There are several categories of people here. There's the unruly. There's the faint-hearted. There's the weak. There's the frustrating and difficult person who you need to show patience towards. And there's the downright wicked, disgraceful person who renders evil for evil. What do you do with all those kinds of people? How do you manage all those kinds of relationships and scenarios? Well, Paul's going to tell us how to do that. In fact, while there are several kinds of people, there are really two categories. There are those who are hurting. There's the weak, there's the faint-hearted, there's the helpless, and there are those who are hurting others, the unruly and the evil person. And so Paul calls the strong to minister to the weak. He calls them to life together. I want you to notice at the beginning of verse 14, "Now we exhort you, brethren, warn those who are unruly, comfort the faint-hearted," so on and so forth. We urge you, brethren. That's a statement you've come across a number of times in this letter. And I believe Paul is addressing himself to the whole church. Some say he's addressing himself to leaders. I think it's the whole church. In fact, John MacArthur outlines this last half of chapter 5 in a very memorable way. He says in verses 12 through 13, we've got what the shepherds ought to do to the sheep and what the sheep ought to do for the shepherds. Then in verses 14 through 15, we've got what the sheep ought to do for the sheep. You see, the existence of pastors does not relieve church members of their responsibility to care for one another. Pastors ought not to be the only ones visiting hospitals, ministering to broken people, counseling those who are struggling. We need to be doing that to each other. Fathers to sons, mothers to daughters, husbands to wives, saints to saints, sheep to sheep. So you've got the shepherds ministering to the sheep respecting and ministering to the shepherds, sheep ministering to sheep, and then from verse 16 following, you've got the shepherds and the sheep ministering to the chief shepherd. Rejoicing in the Lord, praying, not despising prophecies, holding fast to that which is true, abstaining from every form of evil. I think that's a very helpful outline that I'd want you to remember. Now, I was studying this passage and I decided to take a break from the books, and I went out this week. It was a beautiful morning, if I remember, and I headed out of my home and up Meets and along Via Scola for a walk. And a couple of thoughts just hit me as I thought more about this passage. And a couple of things jumped out by way of further introduction. Hang with me, I think these are helpful. There are different categories of people here, and you and I can fit into any one of these categories in any given day. Some days we're unruly and somebody needs to slap us across the jaws to get us back in line. But there's other days we're helpless and we're faint-hearted and somebody needs to come alongside us and pump us up. So don't be thinking these are fixed categories. On any given day, on any given week, we could be in any one of these categories. We could be any one of these kinds of people. Someday we're going to play the role of the doctor. And we're going to come alongside the weak and the faint-hearted and the helpless and encourage them. But there's other days you're not going to play the role of the doctor. You're going to play the role of the patient. You're going to need someone to minister to you. It's a bit like the seesaw. There's some days we're up and there's other days we're down. And Paul would remind us of that fact. Listen to these words by C.H. Spurgeon. Remember I quoted Spurgeon about the minister's fainting fits? This is the opening words of that chapter. As it is recorded that David in the heat of the battle waxed faint, so may it be written that all of the servants of the Lord often faint. Fits of depression come over the most of us. The most of us, okay? Usually cheerful as we may be, we must at intervals be cast down. These are great words here. The strong are not always vigorous. The wise are not always ready. The brave are not always courageous. And the joyous are not always happy. Thank you, Mr. Spurgeon. You're right. Some days we're very strong. There are seasons in life we're up above the clouds. And there are other times in life we're down under the clouds. So this passage is important. You're going to see yourself, I think, in different categories here on any given time in your Christian walk. And then there's this second thought. Given the fact there are different people, it's interesting to note that they're not all treated the same way. You know, my mother was big into honey. I mean, she thought honey was a cure-all. You know, when we would call her up and say, you know what, the girls have got a sore throat, give them a spoonful of honey. You know, it went on and on, ad nauseum. You know, I remember being at home, my dad said his car wasn't working. I said, Dad, put some honey down in the gas tank, maybe that'll help. I mean, honey isn't a cure-all. It's a great thing. And sometimes we look at people and we kind of approach them. We've got an odd verse, we've got a simple thought, and we keep, you know, giving it out in different versions. And Paul would say, come on, that's great. Praise the Lord, you're willing to minister to people. But you need to be a little bit more specific, a little bit more sensitive. The unruly person needs to be admonished, but not the weak person. Don't be shouting at the weak person to get up. Come alongside them softly and gently and help them get up. And I think it's a reminder that you and I need to apply the right medicine to the right patient. Some of you work in the medical field. How notorious is cases of malpractice in the medical field, you know? Cutting off the wrong leg or administering the wrong dose of medicine can be deadly. And Paul's saying that to us. Be careful how you treat someone. Don't make the cure worse than the sickness. I remember being at a conference for Baptists in Belfast, and an item came to the floor of the assembly meeting, and a brother was addressing. It was a bit of a controversial issue among some of our churches. I don't need to tell you what it was, but he addressed it, and some felt he addressed it in a pretty aggressive way. He came out of his corner fighting and kind of set a tone for the day that needed to be dialed back a little bit. And I remember sitting beside an old pastor by the name of Alec Judd, an English guy who was at that time pastoring in Northern Ireland. And he wasn't speaking to me, but I heard him say it, and I've never forgot it. He turned to one of his deacons and said, he just used a sledgehammer to crack a nut. It's a great word. He just said, hey, that could have been handled a much better manner. President Garfield was assassinated, if you know your American history. 1881, July the 2nd, he was shot twice. Once in the arm and one near his spine. But if my readings are correct, he didn't die of the gunshots. Read it for yourself. Historians believe, and people who have looked at his life believe, it was the doctors that killed him. History tells us they operated on him with unsterilized instruments. They went poking around inside our president with their own bare hands. And they believed an infection set in, and a couple of days later, President Garfield was gone, not because of the 2 bullet wounds, but because of the malpractice of the medical staff. Man, in his case, the cure was worse than the sickness. And Paul says, hey, you be careful how you treat people. There are some people you got to pin them to the wall a little bit. The unruly definitely need to be faced. Admonish them. But the faint-hearted, comfort them. The weak, encourage them. So let's look at this passage. If you're wanting an outline ahead of time, I've identified 5 kinds of people here. We're going to look at 2 of them. There's the disorderly, there's the despondent, there's the dependent, there's the difficult, and there's the disgraceful person. Let's look at the first one, the disorderly. Verse 14. Now we exhort you, brethren, warn those who are unruly, comfort the faint-hearted, uphold the weak. The unruly are those who are out of step with everybody else. And they need to be brought back in line with a stern word of warning. This word disorderly or unruly is a military term. It's used of the soldier who doesn't obey orders. It's used of the soldier who steps out of line, who's not in step with the movement of the army. It speaks of the soldier who deserts his post. That's our word. This person's a maverick. This person's a renegade. In fact, in some of the papyri, the writings of this day of Paul, we also have the idea of it's an unwillingness to work, it's an idleness. It's someone who shirks their responsibilities, and those 2 worlds overlap. The soldier believes the rules are for everybody else, not for him. And the unruly person can be idle, shirk his responsibilities and his duties. In fact, some believe that the context takes us back to 1 Thessalonians 4, verse 11, where Paul says, aspire to lead a quiet life, to mind your own business, to work with your own hands. Remember, we saw that we believed there were some there who had got prophetic fever, who were so into the return of Jesus Christ that they were failing on their domestic responsibilities and their everyday obligations. In fact, this comes into the second letter. If you want to go there quickly, in 2 Thessalonians 3 and verses 6 through 7 and verse 11. Let's just go down to verse 11. For we hear that there are some who walk among you in a disorderly manner, not working at all, and who are busybodies. So Paul is maybe identifying a specific group in this church. Those who are checking out of life, who are becoming a nuisance to everybody in the church, who watch brothers and sisters go to work and then they go and ask for benevolent help when they could themselves take care of themselves if they work with their own hands and stop being busybodies and prophetic nuisances. Let's widen the angle here a little bit. Let's just get beyond maybe that specific person, that historical context. The person we're talking about is someone whose nose is always bent out of shape. They're the contrarian to every initiative within the church. They're at the business meeting pointing out the possible flaws and pitfalls of every plan like nobody thought about it before they came to the meeting. They strain at gnats, they swallow camels. They're happy to point out other people's faults, blind to their own. They sit back in judgment. They don't roll up their sleeves and get involved to make sure the thing succeeds. No, they sit in judgment, almost wishing it to fail so that they can get up and pontificate and say, I told you so. They're the bench warmers. If you've ever had to take that role, it's not an easy role if you're a sports guy and you're on a team, but maybe for a season you don't get much play and you're warming the bench. And if you're not careful, you'll stop rooting for the team. And you'll get disappointed. And you'll get disorderly. And then you'll start getting critical of the guy who's playing your position. And then if you don't take care of that, eventually you'll hope he gets his leg broke by the other team so you can play. You start rooting for the other team, believe it or not. And that can happen in churches. You know, even metaphorically speaking, that kind of person starts out sitting towards the front of the church. A few years in, they're towards the middle of the seats, and then they're in the back row and heading out the door. That's not anything to do with you that are sitting at the back. It's a metaphor. But that's the kind of person. Unruly. They're their own boss. They're quick to break ranks. The rules apply to everybody else. What do you do to them? Paul said you admonish them. You don't put up with them. You don't let that bad apple spoil the whole barrel. You confront them. You warn them lovingly but firmly. Enough of that. We heard you, but that's not what we're doing. Don't be overly critical of the leadership. Don't be spreading negativity among the membership. You admonish that person. Paul says in Acts 20:31 that he admonished and warned the Ephesians. In Colossians 1:28, he tells us he warned and admonished the Colossians. Robertson, the Greek grammarian, we said it a few weeks ago, said that this word basically means to knock some sense into somebody's head, to get them back in line, to help them think straight. The unruly must be confronted, admonished, warned. Let me give you a verse. Learn it. Teach your kids it. Proverbs 27, verse 6. Faithful are the wounds of a friend. We don't like that kind of ministry, but it is faithful ministry when somebody with the best intentions, with the right heart, with everything in proportion, comes to you and say, you know what, brother, can I talk to you about your behavior, the way you speak to your wife, the lack of discipline you have with your kids, so on and so forth. There's some things you need to improve on that would help your family and help this ministry. Well, you could react. You could bite back. You ever think about it? Often the person that goes to help a dog that's been wounded stands the chance of being the first one to be bitten. And often when you go to help hurting people who are hurting other people, they turn on you. But faithful are the wounds of a friend. Well, next time you confront someone, remind yourself that you're being faithful to the Lord, you're being faithful to His Word, you're being faithful in your commitment to love that person, you're being faithful to them. In fact, admonition and encouragement belong together. There's a nice balance. They complement each other. You don't want to be in a church where everybody's just encouraging everybody and nobody's getting admonished. You don't want to be in a church where everybody's getting pinned to the wall and nobody's getting loved. Because listen, as one writer says, encouragement is grounded in the biblical assumption that we are fearful people who need God's support. Admonition is grounded in the biblical assumption that we're sinful people and need confronted.
Encouragement and admonition, both are needed in healthy relationships among believers. Well, you're listening to Know the Truth with Philip DeCourcy. Today's message is called Life Together, and it's part of the series Classic Christianity. You'll find links to download or stream the messages or purchase the series on CD when you visit our website. Go to ktt.org. While you're there, you can also check out our featured resource this month, a beautiful illustrated edition of the beloved classic, The Pilgrim's Progress. If you've never read this book, we highly recommend it. The Puritan preacher John Bunyan tells the story of a man named Christian on his journey to the celestial city. It's a powerful allegory describing the dangers and tribulations we all face as we follow Jesus in this life. This book has encouraged and inspired generations of believers, and we'd love to send you a copy today. It comes with our sincere thanks for your support of this ministry when you donate to help us close out the year on a solid financial position. Your generous gift this month helps us begin planning for 2022 so we can reach more people with the good news of the gospel. Here's how to get in touch. Call 888-644-8811. That's 888-644-8811. Or if it's easier, you can give and request the Pilgrim's Progress online at ktt.org. One last thing, if you're new to Know the Truth, we'd love to hear from you. And we've got a free study card from Philip DeCourcy that we'll send you to say welcome when you get in touch for the very first time. It's called A New Look at Christmas, and you can request yours at ktt.org. I'm your host, Wayne Shepherd. Glad to have you with us today. Be sure to join us again next time for more bold, clear, convicting Bible teaching on Know the Truth. Today's program was produced and sponsored by Know the Truth Incorporated. Jesus said, "You shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free."